October 4, 1957, Eastern United States, after sunset. Radio operators across the East Coast hunched over their amateur equipment in basements and garages, tuning through familiar frequencies the way they did most evenings, listening for distant contacts, monitoring weather broadcasts, checking in with networks they'd maintained since the war. The bands were unusually busy that Friday night, voices crackling through the static with an edge of excitement that pulled operators back to their headphones even when they'd been about to shut down for the night. Then someone caught it, a sound that didn't belong, a signal at 20 5 megahertz that wasn't any kind of transmission they'd ever heard before, a steady electronic pulse, beep beep beep, mechanical and alien, and utterly foreign to everything that had ever moved through Earth's atmosphere. Near Riverhead on Long Island, RCA engineers were the first to make a recording, the magnetic tape catching those rhythmic pulses as they swept overhead, fading in from the northern horizon, growing stronger, then diminishing toward the south, as whatever was transmitting them moved faster than anything had a right to move. At Columbia University, the W2AEE amateur station picked up the same signal minutes later, and within the hour station WKCR-FM was rebroadcasting it to anyone with a radio in the New York metropolitan area. That hypnotic beep 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 that sounded like Morse code but wasn't, that carried no message anyone could decode but announced its presence with absolute clarity. At the Deal Test Area, a satellite campus of Fort Monmouth in New Jersey, military personnel detected the transmission and began recording, their oscilloscopes tracing the signal strength as it rose and fell, their calculations placing the source not on Earth but somewhere overhead, moving at impossible velocity across the continental United States. By midnight, thousands of Americans had heard it, that sound from space that announced without words or fanfare that the world had changed in ways they were only beginning to understand. For the radio operators and engineers who tracked that first pass, the technical characteristics were immediately obvious and deeply troubling. The signal was strong, far stronger than any satellite transmission they'd been led to expect from American planning documents, suggesting a transmitter with substantial power and batteries that could sustain it for days or weeks. The Doppler shift was unmistakable, the frequency climbing as the source approached and falling as it receded, exactly the pattern you'd expect from something moving at orbital velocity, roughly 8 kilometers per second or 18,000 miles per hour. The timing was precise, the signal reappearing every 96 minutes as whatever was up there completed another circuit of the planet, passing over American territory again and again with the regularity of a clock, visible to anyone with basic radio equipment and the patience to listen. What troubled them most wasn't the technical achievement itself, but what it revealed about capabilities they thought belonged exclusively to the United States, the ability to place a functioning machine in orbit where it could see everything below, where it could broadcast continuously to anyone listening, where it could demonstrate mastery of technologies that were supposed to keep America safe. The news had actually broken hours earlier, before the signal reached American shores, transmitted through official channels and press reports from Moscow that many in Washington initially dismissed as propaganda or exaggeration. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev had received a phone call 90 minutes after launch from chief designer Sergei Korolev, confirming that the satellite was in orbit, that its transmitters were functioning, that the R-7 rocket had performed exactly as designed. TASS announced it to the world within hours, describing a polished aluminum sphere 58 centimeters in diameter, weighing 184 pounds, circling the Earth every 96.2 minutes at an inclination of 65 degrees, carrying 2 radio transmitters broadcasting on frequencies amateur operators could easily detect. The American press picked up the story late Friday afternoon, running with headlines that ranged from skeptical to alarmed, but it wasn't until ordinary Americans heard that beeping with their own ears that the full weight of it settled across the country like a cold front moving in from the north. President Dwight Eisenhower was at his Gettysburg farm when he received the news, and his initial response was low-key to the point of dismissal, exactly what you'd expect from a man who'd commanded armies and understood that panic served no strategic purpose. He'd been briefed on Soviet satellite progress through CIA intelligence gathered by U-2 spy planes flying over Soviet territory, and he knew the launch was coming, had in fact deliberately chosen a path that would allow the Soviets to go first and establish the legal precedent for orbital overflight of sovereign nations. What Eisenhower understood, and what most Americans didn't, was that establishing freedom of space was essential to the secret WS-117L reconnaissance satellite program that would eventually give the United States unprecedented intelligence-gathering capabilities. He saw Sputnik not as a threat but as a useful precedent, a Soviet accomplishment that opened the door for American satellites to pass over Soviet territory without legal challenge. What he failed to anticipate, what caught him completely off guard, was the psychological impact on the American public and the political firestorm that would consume the next 3 months. Senator Lyndon Baines Johnson heard about Sputnik while hosting a barbecue at his Texas ranch that same Friday evening, the news crackling through a radio as guests stood under the darkening sky with plates of brisket and conversations that suddenly seemed trivial. Johnson would later describe the moment with the dramatic flair that characterized his political career, saying the sky seemed almost alien, that he felt a profound shock of realizing it might be possible for another nation to achieve technological superiority over the United States. Whether his reaction was genuinely that visceral, or whether he recognized immediately the political opportunity it presented, is a question historians still debate, but there's no debating what came next. Within weeks, Johnson would open Senate Armed Services subcommittee hearings that would stretch through January 1958, 73 witnesses producing 1,300 pages of testimony that transformed the American perception of the space race from a scientific curiosity into a matter of national survival. The question Americans asked in those first hours wasn't whether the Soviets had actually done it. The evidence was beeping overhead every 96 minutes, but how they'd managed it when everything in American culture suggested such achievements belonged exclusively to the West. The United States had ended World War II with the atomic bomb, had maintained nuclear superiority through the development of thermonuclear weapons, had captured German rocket scientists including Wernher von Braun and brought them to America where they were supposedly building the future. The American economy was the strongest in human history. American universities dominated scientific research. American industry produced more steel and more automobiles and more of everything than any nation had ever produced. The narrative Americans told themselves was one of inevitable technological progress, of scientific advancement that flowed naturally from democratic capitalism, of an innovation engine that communist central planning could never match. Sputnik didn't just challenge that narrative, it inverted it, suggesting that maybe the Soviets understood something about large-scale technical programs that Americans had missed. What Sputnik actually proved, beyond any propaganda or interpretation, was that the Soviet Union possessed operational intercontinental ballistic missile technology capable of delivering a nuclear warhead to any city in the United States in less than an hour. The R-7 rocket that launched Sputnik into orbit was fundamentally an ICBM designed to carry hydrogen bombs across continents, and if it could place a satellite in orbit, it could certainly place a warhead on New York or Washington or Los Angeles. American missile technology, in October 1957, couldn't match that capability. The Atlas ICBM was still in development and wouldn't achieve its first successful flight test for months. The Army's Redstone missile under von Braun's direction had the range to reach Europe from forward positions but couldn't cross oceans. The Navy's Vanguard program, selected in 1955 as America's official contribution to the International Geophysical Year, hadn't yet achieved a successful orbital launch and was running far behind schedule. The United States had strategic bombers that could deliver nuclear weapons, but bombers took hours to reach their targets and could be intercepted by fighters or surface-to-air missiles, while ICBMs traveled too fast for any existing defensive system to stop. The choice to proceed with Vanguard instead of the Army's competing proposal had been made 2 years earlier, in August 1955, when the Stewart Committee voted 5-2 to select the Navy's civilian-oriented program over the Army's Project Orbiter. The reasoning seemed sound at the time. Vanguard would use newly designed rockets rather than diverting military missiles from their primary mission, would be managed by the Naval Research Laboratory with its reputation for scientific rather than military research, and would avoid the political complications of using von Braun, whose past as a Nazi SS officer building V-2 rockets with slave labor remained controversial. The decision also reflected Eisenhower's belief that keeping space activities civilian would better serve American prestige and would establish useful precedents for reconnaissance satellites that needed to operate over Soviet territory without being treated as acts of war. What the decision failed to account for was the possibility that the Soviets would beat America into space by a significant margin, or that the American public would interpret that achievement as evidence of comprehensive technological inferiority. Vanguard in October 1957 was a beautiful piece of engineering that wasn't ready to fly. The rocket stood 72 feet tall with a diameter of 45 inches, a three-stage vehicle that represented advanced thinking about rocket design, with a first stage using kerosene and liquid oxygen generating 28,000 pounds of thrust, a second stage using unsymmetrical dimethylhydrazine and white-inhibited fuming nitric acid generating 7,500 pounds of thrust, and a solid-fuel third stage to provide the final push into orbit. The satellite itself was tiny, weighing less than 4 pounds with a diameter of 6 inches, what Khrushchev would later mockingly call a grapefruit compared to the Soviet Union's basketball-sized achievement. The program had experienced one failure already, a test launch on December 8, 1956, that had gone spectacularly wrong, and a partially successful test on May 4, 1957, that had demonstrated some systems but hadn't attempted to reach orbit. The next test was scheduled for late October, just weeks after Sputnik, and the pressure to accelerate the schedule was building even before the Soviet satellite started beeping. Meanwhile, von Braun's team at the Army Ballistic Missile Agency in Huntsville, Alabama, had been ready to launch a satellite more than a year earlier, and had been explicitly ordered not to do so. In 1956, von Braun had ridden with a Redstone missile designated number 29 to the launch pad, the rocket fully fueled and equipped with upper stages that could have placed a small satellite in orbit, demonstrating American capability months before the Soviets achieved their success. The order came down from Washington to roll the rocket back to the hangar, to not attempt the launch, to wait for Vanguard to establish America's presence in space through the officially designated civilian program. Von Braun had complied because military officers comply with orders. But the frustration among his team was palpable and would become even more pointed after October 4, when everyone recognized that America had voluntarily surrendered the prestige of being first into space for reasons that seemed increasingly indefensible. The tracking of Sputnik became an obsession at facilities across the United States in those first days, not because the Pentagon ordered it. Most installations acted before receiving official guidance, but because the people involved understood immediately that this was important. At the Deal Test area in New Jersey, Dr. Harold Zahl, the director of research at Fort Monmouth, organized what he called the Royal Order of Sputnik Chasers, a group of engineers and technicians who maintained 24-hour observation schedules without overtime pay or official authorization because, as Zahl put it, duty called desperately. They observed 273 orbits and recorded approximately 500 hours of continuous monitoring, their oscilloscopes and recording equipment capturing every detail of the signal as it swept overhead, building up a database of observations that would prove scientifically valuable and strategically crucial. The mini-track network of 6 major stations running from the east coast of North America to the west coast of South America came online specifically to track Sputnik, demonstrating capabilities that had been built for Vanguard but now served to monitor the Soviet achievement. At the University of Illinois Observatory in Urbana, astronomers George McVitie, Stanley Wyatt, and Ivan King worked with mathematician Donald Gillies and physicist James Snyder to calculate Sputnik's orbital elements using the Al-Iliac I computer, one of the first large-scale digital computers in university hands. They derived precise ephemerides that predicted when and where the satellite would appear in the sky, publishing their results in the journal Nature by November 1957, demonstrating that American scientific infrastructure could track and analyze what the Soviets had launched even if America hadn't launched it first. The data revealed exactly how high Sputnik was flying, how its orbit was decaying as it encountered wisps of atmosphere, even 200 miles above Earth's surface, and how long it would remain in space before burning up on re-entry. The calculations were elegant and precise, the kind of work that American universities excelled at, but they couldn't change the fundamental fact that the satellite they were tracking came from the Soviet Union. The first confirmed visual observation of Sputnik came on October 10 in New Haven, Connecticut, 6 days after launch, though what observers actually saw wasn't the 58-centimeter satellite but the R-7 rocket's core stage, an 85-foot metal tube that remained in orbit alongside the satellite and reflected enough sunlight to be visible to the naked eye at dawn and dusk. The Smithsonian Astrophysical Observatory's Operation Moonwatch, a network of 150 amateur teams equipped with small telescopes, eventually recorded 363 confirmed visual sightings during Sputnik's 3-month lifetime, each observation adding to the accumulating evidence that this thing was real, was overhead, was passing over American territory multiple times per day. For ordinary Americans who ventured outside in the evening or early morning to look for it, the experience of seeing that moving point of light was visceral in a way that hearing the radio signal wasn't, a visible reminder that human machinery now moved through the heavens where previously only natural objects had traveled. What Americans were witnessing without fully understanding it was the fruit of Soviet decisions made years earlier to prioritize heavy-lift rocket development for both military and space purposes. The R-7 was a massive rocket by the standards of the time, far larger than anything in the American inventory, because Soviet hydrogen bomb designs were heavier than American designs and required more throw weight to deliver across intercontinental distances. That same heavy lift capability that made the R-7 an effective ICBM also made it an effective satellite launcher, able to place a 184-pound payload in orbit, while American rockets struggled to lift payloads a tenth that size. The Soviet achievement reflected neither superior understanding of orbital mechanics, American scientists were equally capable, nor superior electronics, American miniaturization was already ahead of Soviet capabilities, but simply the possession of a larger rocket that could brute force its way past the constraints that limited American vehicles. The political response in Washington took several days to build momentum, initially confused by Eisenhower's measured reaction and by the difficulty of explaining to the public exactly why they should be concerned. On October 9, 5 days after launch, Eisenhower held his 123rd press conference and delivered the line that would define his initial response and haunt him for months afterward. "Now, so far as the satellite itself is concerned," he said, "that does not raise my apprehensions, not one iota. He emphasized that the satellite's weight was not commensurate with anything of great military significance, that the scientific value was interesting but not threatening, that the United States had deliberately chosen a methodical approach to space that would yield better long-term results than rushing to be first. What sounded reasonable to Eisenhower, who had access to classified intelligence showing American nuclear superiority, sounded tone-deaf to a public that was hearing Soviet achievements trumpeted from Moscow and wondering why their president seemed unconcerned that another nation had beaten America into space. The media response was immediate and overwhelming, transforming what might have remained a scientific curiosity into a full-blown national crisis through the sheer volume and intensity of coverage. The New York Times ran 279 articles about Sputnik between October 6 and October 30, averaging more than 11 articles per day, covering every conceivable angle from technical analysis to political implications to man-on-the-street reactions. Headlines proclaimed Soviet propaganda victories and American prestige damage, questioned American scientific education and military preparedness, demanded explanations for how the Soviets had achieved something that American officials had confidently predicted the United States would do first. Television programs examined the crisis from every angle. Education editors reported that hardly a week passed without several television programs examining American schools and whether they were adequately preparing students for competition with the Soviet Union. The coverage fed on itself, each story generating more concern that justified more coverage, creating what later analysts would describe as a moral panic, amplified by media institutions that benefited from sustained public attention. On November 3, less than a month after Sputnik 1, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 2, and this time the payload was impossible to dismiss as insignificant. Where Sputnik 1 had weighed 184 pounds, Sputnik 2 weighed 1,120 pounds, more than 6 times heavier, and carried a living passenger, a dog named Laika, demonstrating that Soviet rockets could lift substantial payloads and that living creatures could survive launch and orbit. The psychological impact was profound, confirming that the first Sputnik hadn't been a fluke or a one-time achievement, but represented sustained capability that the Soviets could exercise at will. The satellite passed over American territory just as regularly as its predecessor, its radio signals even stronger, its very existence a reminder that the technological gap was real and that American responses were trailing Soviet accomplishments by a widening margin. Historians would later characterize this as Strike 2 in a 3-strike sequence that transformed American public opinion from concerned to genuinely alarmed. The pressure on Project Vanguard to deliver a successful launch intensified to unbearable levels, the program becoming a test not just of American rocket technology, but of American credibility and prestige. The next test vehicle, designated TV-3, was scheduled for early December, accelerated from its original timeline by the desperate need to demonstrate that America could match Soviet achievements. On December 6, 1957, at 11:44 and 35 seconds in the morning, the Vanguard rocket ignited on its launch pad at Cape Canaveral with television cameras broadcasting live and reporters from around the world watching. The rocket rose approximately 4 feet off the pad, hesitated, and then collapsed back down in a massive fireball as its fuel tanks ruptured, and 20,000 pounds of kerosene and liquid oxygen ignited in a spectacular explosion that consumed the launch vehicle and scorched the pad. The satellite, miraculously intact, was thrown clear by the blast and landed in bushes near the pad, its radio transmitter beeping forlornly as crews fought the fires and tried to comprehend what had just happened. The failure was broadcast to a global audience that had gathered specifically to witness American technological prowess, and the humiliation was immediate and comprehensive. The British press dubbed it Flopnik and Kaputnik, American newspapers called it a useless hunk of iron, and Soviet propaganda made the most of the disaster, contrasting American failure with Soviet success in the most unflattering terms possible. Trading on the American Stock Exchange was suspended for Martin Company stock at 11:50 a.m. and didn't resume until 1:23 p.m., the most actively traded stock of the day, experiencing violent price reactions as investors tried to price in the implications of such a public technical failure. Columnist Dorothy Kilgallen wrote in the New York Journal American about the satellite beeping in the bushes, asking why somebody didn't just go out there, find it and shoot it. The joke captured the national mood, a mixture of embarrassment, frustration, and dark humor at American expense that felt profoundly unfamiliar to a population accustomed to thinking of their country as the world's technological giant. What had gone wrong with TV-3 was a failure of the most basic kind, a loss of fuel pressure in the first stage engine that allowed hot exhaust gases to back up into the injector head, destroying it and causing complete loss of thrust just 2 seconds after ignition. The failure analysis revealed nothing exotic, no mysterious Soviet sabotage or fundamental design flaw, just the kind of problem that occurs in complex machines when testing reveals weaknesses that weren't apparent in design. George S. Trimble Jr., vice president of the Martin Company, had warned the New York Times the day of the launch that failure usually resulted at least 3 times out of 7 with this type of testing, that expecting perfection was unrealistic given the state of rocket technology in 1957. His warning went unheeded by a public and media that needed success and interpreted failure as evidence of systemic inadequacy rather than normal testing outcomes. The three-strike theory of the Sputnik crisis, articulated years later by Roger Larnius, the former chief historian of NASA, suggests that public alarm didn't reach critical levels until all 3 events had occurred in sequence. Strike 1 was Sputnik 1 on October 4, surprising but potentially explainable as a lucky Soviet success. Strike 2 was Sputnik 2 on November 3, demonstrating sustained capability and substantial payload capacity. Strike 3 was the Vanguard TV3 failure on December 6, proving through spectacular televised failure that American technology wasn't ready to compete. Together, these 3 events created a narrative of Soviet ascendancy and American decline that became politically impossible to ignore, regardless of whether the underlying technical and strategic realities supported such sweeping conclusions. Political analyst Samuel Lubell would later argue that the panic was elite rather than popular, that ordinary Americans showed no evidence of hysteria in their daily behavior, but whether the concern was genuine or manufactured, its political consequences were undeniable. The response, when it finally came, represented a wholesale acceleration of American space and science programs that dwarfed anything that had been politically possible before October 1957. On January 31, 1958, just under 4 months after Sputnik, the Army Ballistic Missile Agency and Jet Propulsion Laboratory successfully launched Explorer 1 using a modified Redstone missile, finally placing an American satellite in orbit and demonstrating that American technology worked when given the authorization and resources to proceed. Explorer 1 was lighter than Sputnik, but carried instruments that made the first major scientific discovery of the space age, detecting the Van Allen radiation belts that surround Earth, proving that American satellites could do more than just beep. The success partially restored American confidence and demonstrated that von Braun's team had been ready all along, waiting for permission that came 3 months too late to claim the prestige of being first. In February 1958, Eisenhower authorized the creation of the Advanced Research Projects Agency, initially called ARPA and later renamed DARPA, within the Department of Defense, to coordinate advanced military research including space technology and missile defense. The agency represented a recognition that American research efforts had been too fragmented, too competitive between service branches, too focused on incremental improvements rather than breakthrough capabilities. ARPA would eventually become legendary for funding high-risk, high-reward research that led to technologies ranging from stealth aircraft to the internet, but in February 1958, it was simply an admission that the existing system hadn't been adequate to prevent Soviet surprise. On July 29, 1958, Eisenhower signed the National Aeronautics and Space Act, creating NASA as a civilian space agency that would absorb the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics and take control of American space activities from the competing military services. NASA began operations on October 1, 1958, exactly 1 year after Sputnik, with a mandate to pursue space exploration for peaceful purposes and to restore American prestige through visible accomplishments. The decision to create a civilian agency, rather than leaving space to the military, reflected the same logic that had led to choosing Vanguard over the Army's proposal 3 years earlier, but this time the civilian agency would have the budget and political support to actually accomplish its mission rather than operating on a shoestring, while military programs received priority. The National Defense Education Act passed in September 1958, less than a year after Sputnik, appropriating billions of dollars over 4 years for education programs with emphasis on mathematics, science, and foreign languages. The act provided low-interest loans for students pursuing technical degrees, funded equipment purchases for schools and universities, and supported curriculum development in fields deemed critical to national security. The transformation in science funding was dramatic and immediate, with the National Science Foundation's appropriation jumping from approximately $34 million in 1958 to $134 million in 1959, an increase of nearly $100 million in a single year. By 1968, NSF's budget would reach $500 million annually, and NASA would be providing approximately 10% of all federal academic research funding. Astronomer John Jefferies captured the change perfectly when he said the week after Sputnik went up, scientists were digging themselves out of an avalanche of money that suddenly descended from the federal government. The debate over whether Sputnik actually caused these changes or simply accelerated programs that were already developing has occupied historians for decades, with evidence supporting both interpretations. Education interest groups had been lobbying for federal support for years before October 1957, and the National Science Foundation had received adequate funding in fiscal year 1957 before anyone heard Sputnik's beep. The director of the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, Hugh Dryden, had been shifting his organization towards space research between 1954 and 1957, recognizing that aeronautics was evolving into astronautics. Missile development programs were well underway before Sputnik, driven by military requirements rather than space exploration goals. What was lacking, what Sputnik provided, was the sense of urgency and the political consensus that made large-scale spending politically feasible rather than politically risky. Sputnik was, in this interpretation, the last piece of the puzzle rather than the first, the catalyst that transformed existing plans into funded programs. The psychological impact of Sputnik on American culture extended far beyond immediate policy changes, creating a generation of scientists and engineers who traced their career choices directly to that moment of national technological shock. Franklin Chang Diaz, who would become a NASA astronaut and fly 7 space shuttle missions, was 7 years old in Costa Rica in October 1957 when Sputnik launched, unable to see the satellite from his location, but absolutely certain from the news coverage that space was his future. Thousands of American students made similar decisions in 1957 and 1958, choosing technical majors and scientific careers because their country needed them, because competing with the Soviet Union required more engineers and physicists and mathematicians than the existing education system was producing. Whether these individual decisions were based on genuine national security concerns or simply reflected the cultural moment is less important than their collective impact, a surge in technical education that would power American technological advancement through the following decades. What's striking in retrospect is how much of the alarm was based on perceptions that intelligence agencies knew were inaccurate but couldn't publicly correct without revealing sources and methods. The CIA had been flying U-2 reconnaissance aircraft over Soviet territory since 1956, photographing military installations and industrial facilities, gathering evidence that America's nuclear arsenal was substantially larger than the Soviet equivalent. Eisenhower knew from classified briefings that there was no missile gap, that Soviet ICBM production was limited, that American strategic bombers could deliver far more nuclear weapons than Soviet rockets could intercept. The intelligence advantage meant that Soviet achievements, while real, didn't translate into the kind of immediate military threat that public rhetoric suggested. But Eisenhower couldn't explain this to the American public without compromising the U-2 program, couldn't calm the panic without revealing that America was routinely violating Soviet airspace, so he was forced to accept political damage rather than disclose methods that provided crucial strategic intelligence. The missile gap became the defining issue of the 1960 presidential campaign, with Senator John F. Kennedy attacking the Eisenhower administration for allowing American defenses to deteriorate while Soviet missile production supposedly surged ahead. Kennedy promised to build 1,000 Minuteman intercontinental ballistic missiles, a number far exceeding anything the Soviets had or were building, closing a gap that intelligence agencies knew didn't exist in the form Kennedy described. Kennedy later admitted privately that the space race was a waste of money, but he recognized the political benefits of addressing a frightened electorate's concerns and the prestige value of visible technical accomplishments. The space race, in Kennedy's calculation, was less about intrinsic scientific or military importance and more about reassuring Americans that their country was still the world's technological leader, still capable of matching and exceeding Soviet achievements. At Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, 2 scientists named George Wyffenbach and William Guyer picked up Sputnik's radio signals during one of its early passes and noticed something interesting in the Doppler shift pattern. As the satellite approached, its radio frequency increased relative to what it would have been if stationary, and as it receded, the frequency decreased, exactly as expected from basic physics. What Wyffenbach and Guyer realized was that by precisely measuring this Doppler shift over time, they could calculate the satellite's velocity and trajectory, could determine exactly where it was in space based solely on radio observations. Frank T. McClure, the lab's deputy director, asked what turned out to be the crucial follow-on question. If you can determine a satellite's position by observing it from a known location, can you determine your location by observing a satellite from an unknown position? The answer was yes, and that insight led directly to the Transit Satellite Navigation System and eventually to the Global Positioning System that now guides everything from car navigation to precision weapons. Soviet scientists and engineers experienced their own moment of shocked recognition when they realized the extent of their achievement and its international impact, though their surprise ran in the opposite direction from American alarm. Soviet engineers had labored under severe material constraints, working with aluminum and magnesium alloys that were heavier than American equivalents, designing systems that were robust rather than miniaturized because Soviet electronics lagged behind Western capabilities. The decision to make Sputnik's transmitters operate on frequencies that amateur radio operators could easily detect was deliberate, intended to maximize the propaganda value by allowing anyone with basic equipment to verify that the satellite was real. What Soviet scientists hadn't fully anticipated was how their success would be interpreted abroad, not as a clever engineering achievement under difficult constraints, but as evidence of comprehensive technological superiority across the entire scientific and industrial base. One unnamed Soviet scientist in Moscow captured the essential irony when he told reporters that Americans designed better automobile tail fins, but the Soviet Union designed the best intercontinental ballistic missiles and Earth satellites. The quote reflected genuine puzzlement at American priorities, at a country that could produce magnificent consumer goods and seemingly frivolous luxury items but had somehow allowed another nation to beat it into space. From the Soviet perspective, their achievement proved that central planning could concentrate resources on national priorities in ways that market economies couldn't match, that socialist organization could overcome material disadvantages through superior coordination and dedication. That interpretation would prove less durable than Soviet confidence in 1957 suggested, but in the immediate aftermath of Sputnik it felt validated by events. Khrushchev understood the propaganda value perfectly and exploited it ruthlessly, announcing to Western audiences that Soviet potential enemies cringed in fright, that the correlation of forces was shifting in favor of socialism, that the future belonged to the system that could harness science and technology most effectively. He also understood the gap between propaganda and reality, privately admitting it had always sounded good to say in public speeches that Soviet missiles could hit a fly at any distance, suggesting he recognized the limitations even while publicly projecting confidence. Khrushchev pushed hard for Sputnik 2 to launch in time for the 40th anniversary of the October Revolution, wanting to maximize the political impact with anniversary celebrations, demonstrating how thoroughly space achievement had become intertwined with Cold War prestige competition. The technical lessons learned from Sputnik tracking proved more valuable than anyone anticipated at the time, establishing methods and developing infrastructure that would serve American space efforts for decades. The mini-track network developed for Vanguard evolved into NAV Spasuyor, the naval space surveillance system that became operational in 1959 with 3 transmitter sites and 6 receiver sites along the 33rd parallel, able to detect any object crossing that line in space and maintain a catalogue of everything in orbit. The Smithsonian Astrophysical Observatory deployed 12 Baker-Nunn cameras at fixed sites around the world, starting in 1958, able to photograph satellites up to 2,000 miles altitude and provide precise orbital tracking data. These systems gave the United States comprehensive awareness of what was in space, who put it there, and what it was doing, turning initial disadvantage into long-term advantage through systematic investment in tracking infrastructure that exceeded anything the Soviets deployed. The question of whether American scientists were genuinely shocked by Sputnik or simply caught off guard by the timing remains contested among historians who've examined the documentary evidence. General James M. Gavin of the Army had predicted to the Army Scientific Advisory Panel on September 12, 1957, that the Soviets would launch a satellite within 30 days, a prediction that proved accurate almost to the day. Von Braun had agreed with Gavin that launch was imminent based on intelligence indicators and technical analysis of Soviet progress. The intelligence community had photographic evidence of Soviet rocket development and had monitored Soviet statements about their satellite program during the International Geophysical Year. What seems clear is that the possibility of a Soviet satellite was well understood in military and scientific circles, but the political leadership had failed to communicate that possibility to the public or to prepare for the psychological impact of being second into space. The shock, when it came, was less about technical surprise. Informed observers knew it was coming, and more about cultural and psychological unpreparedness for a world where American technological superiority wasn't automatic and guaranteed. Americans in 1957 had grown up believing their country was the technological giant of the world, that innovation naturally flourished in free societies, that communist systems were inherently inferior at producing scientific and technical progress. Sputnik challenged all of those assumptions simultaneously, forcing Americans to question their advantages in areas far beyond space technology. If the Soviets could beat America into space, what else might they achieve? Were American schools adequately preparing students? Was American industrial organization as efficient as it should be? Had complacency and consumer focus distracted from more important national priorities? These questions couldn't be answered quickly or easily, and the national conversation they generated lasted not weeks but years. The creation of what historians now call the Sputnik moment as a cultural reference point, a shorthand for technological shock that demands urgent response, has proven remarkably durable in American discourse. Presidential candidates and policy advocates regularly call for new Sputnik moments to galvanize national action on everything from energy policy to artificial intelligence, invoking 1957 as the template for how crisis can drive transformation. Whether those invocations reflect accurate understanding of what actually happened in 1957, or simply mythologize a more complicated reality is debatable, but the persistence of the reference demonstrates how deeply Sputnik penetrated American consciousness. The satellite that beeped for 22 days until its batteries died and burned up after 3 months became permanently embedded in American memory as the moment when the future arrived from an unexpected direction. What remains undeniable is that Sputnik accelerated American space efforts by years if not decades, concentrating resources and political will in ways that peacetime competition probably couldn't have achieved without Cold War urgency. The space race that began in October 1957 led directly to Project Apollo and the moon landings, to reconnaissance satellites that prevented surprise attack, to weather satellites that saved countless lives through storm warnings, to communications satellites that transformed global information exchange, to navigation satellites that now underpin vast portions of modern infrastructure. Space journalist Jay Barbary estimated that these accomplishments came 50 years ahead of where they would have been without the pressure Sputnik created, suggesting that Soviet success paradoxically accelerated American technological development by providing the political justification for massive investment that wouldn't otherwise have been possible. The Soviet Union won the race to launch the first satellite, but the United States won the larger competition through sustained investment in space infrastructure, scientific education, and technological innovation that eventually produced capabilities the Soviets couldn't match. The pattern repeated across multiple domains, Soviet achievement driving American response exceeding Soviet capability, leading to new Soviet efforts to close gaps that kept widening. The system competition that Sputnik intensified ultimately favored the side with greater industrial capacity, more flexible scientific institutions, and an economy that could sustain high-technology investment without sacrificing consumer needs. The basketball-sized satellite that beeped its way across American skies for 3 months announced not Soviet victory but the beginning of a competition the Soviet system wasn't structured to win. On January 4, 1958, after 1,440 orbits covering approximately 70 million kilometers, Sputnik 1 encountered enough atmospheric resistance at perigee to begin its final descent, burning up over the atmosphere in a streak of light that few observers noticed. The satellite was gone, but its impact remained, embedded in American institutions and policies that would outlast the Cold War itself. The scientists and engineers who chose technical careers because of Sputnik built the technologies that define modern life. The education programs launched in response to Sputnik created research universities that still dominate global rankings. The space agency created to restore American prestige sent humans to another world and robots to the edge of the solar system. The intelligence infrastructure built to track Soviet satellites evolved into systems that monitor every object in orbit and provide early warning of missile launches from anywhere on Earth. For the radio operators who first detected that beeping signal on October 4, 1957, the experience remained vivid for the rest of their lives, a moment when they knew immediately that something significant had happened even if they couldn't fully articulate why. The sound itself became iconic, that simple beep 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 that announced the space age more effectively than any words could have, that communicated across language barriers and political systems, the simple fact that humans had placed a machine in orbit where it would remain until natural forces brought it down. It was a sound that belonged to no single nation, despite being transmitted from a Soviet satellite, a sound that declared humanity had taken the first small step toward becoming a spacefaring species, regardless of which political system claimed credit. What the scientists and engineers on both sides understood, even through the fog of Cold War competition and political exploitation, was that space exploration represented something genuinely new in human history, a frontier that both superpowers were exploring simultaneously through competing approaches. The competition drove progress faster than cooperation could have, each side pushing harder because the other side was watching and judging and measuring every achievement. That competition was wasteful, duplicative, and driven by military concerns that had nothing to do with science, but it was also spectacularly productive, generating technologies and capabilities that transformed human civilization in ways that are still unfolding. The satellite that shocked American scientists in 1957 was both a weapon in Cold War competition and a tool of scientific exploration, both a source of political crisis and a driver of technological progress, both uniquely Soviet and universally human. Standing outside on a clear evening in late 1957, watching for that moving point of light that marked humanity's first artificial satellite, Americans experienced a profound shift in perspective that's difficult to fully capture in retrospect. The sky had always been the realm of natural objects, stars and planets and the moon moving in patterns that ancient astronomers had mapped, but now there was something new up there, something that humans had built and launched and controlled. That shift from Earth as the boundary of human activity to Earth as the starting point for human expansion into space represented a psychological threshold that couldn't be uncrossed. Sputnik's beep announced that threshold had been crossed, and regardless of who crossed it first, everyone recognized that the future would be different because of it. The question of what would have happened if America had launched first, if von Braun had been authorized to proceed in 1956, if Vanguard had succeeded before the Soviets launched, remains one of history's interesting counterfactuals. Would the space race have unfolded differently? Would the sense of urgency have been less? Would the investments in education and research have materialized without crisis to justify them? The answers are unknowable, but the questions suggest that Soviet success, while embarrassing to American pride, may have been fortunate for American long-term interests by creating the political conditions for sustained investment that might not otherwise have occurred. Sometimes losing a battle creates the determination to win the war, and the history of the space age suggests that pattern played out exactly as that formulation would predict. What became clear in the years after Sputnik was that American advantages in industrial capacity, economic strength, and scientific infrastructure were real and substantial, but those advantages only translated into space achievements when political will supported their application to space programs. The United States had the capability to match and exceed Soviet space accomplishments from the beginning, but capability without commitment produced no results. Sputnik provided the commitment by making space a matter of national prestige that politicians couldn't ignore. The satellite that beeped overhead every 96 minutes was less than 2 feet in diameter and weighed less than 200 pounds, but it shifted billions of dollars of resources, redirected thousands of careers, and transformed American science policy in ways that still echo today. For future generations trying to understand why the space age began when and how it did, why humans went to the moon in 1969 rather than 1989 or never, the answer leads back to that evening in October 1957 when a Soviet satellite began transmitting and American radio operators detected its signal. The technology that made Sputnik possible had been developing for years on both sides, the physics was well understood, the engineering was challenging but not impossible, but the political commitment to actually do it required crisis to catalyze. The Soviet Union provided that crisis through their achievement, and the United States responded with investments that ultimately produced space capabilities exceeding anything the Soviets could match. The irony is profound. Soviet success drove American accomplishment, and American response demonstrated the superiority of the system the Soviets were trying to challenge. Have you ever wondered what specific technological breakthroughs came directly from space program investments after Sputnik? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this deep dive into Cold War space history captured your interest, subscribe for more detailed explorations of the technologies and strategies that defined the superpower competition.